My name is John Lobell. I teach architecture at Pratt Institute. I blog at johnlobell.com, review movies from a mythological point of view at cinemadiscourse.com, and you can reach me at johnlobell@mac.com. This is a recording of a lecture I did in October 2013 for a course I teach in non-Western architecture. We've looked at a whole series of non-Western cultures, and now we're going to look at the West and treat it in similar terms to the way that we treated the other cultures, so that we can see the West not as the culture, but as one of several cultures. And I'm going to begin with a principle that I use throughout, that a high culture starts by laying down its temple form and its epic poem, which then contain the psychology of the culture. We want to look at the West, and I'll refer to them, the West and them, and try to see it in some of the same terms that we've been looking at, these non-Western cultures. So we'll have a point of comparison. So let's start with a background, a slide you've seen many times. It's my contention that each of these cultures has a sort of psychology that's communicated in their mythology or religion, their art and their architecture. And one of the things I want to do here is suggest that what I'm calling the West, Europe, and then later America, is different from Greece or Greece and Rome. And so these are different cultures. There's an influence. We'll talk about that shortly. But one of the differences is, while they both focus on the individual, in Greece, the individual is seen as subject to fate. You see that in, for example, the myth of Prometheus, where he rails at his fate of being punished by Zeus. In the West, there's a defiance and a sense that morality comes from one's inner moral compass rather than rules of society or the rules of a creator, as we see in the Middle East. So just an example, I'll take as the prime symbol of the psychological orientation of Egyptian culture as the way. One proceeds according to precise rules through the course of one's life. And even in death, in the Book of the Dead, there's a whole set of steps that one goes through which, after death, which are prescribed in detail in the Book of the Dead. The pyramids are actually part of complexes that had these passageways. So there's this notion of the way. And the Egyptian temple, you pass through a series of rams or sphinxes, and you have your two obelisks, the pylon, into the hypostyle courtyard, then hypostyle hall, and then the inner sanctuary. And you proceed in this prescribed way. You don't say, well, I'll go wander around, see what's in back. You don't do that. It's no such concept. And then there's no ornament on walls because no one's supposed to be back there. The experience is this way. And the columns are on the inside, opposite of what we have in the Greek temple, because this is where we're supposed to be, and the columns then shield the walls, which they do in the Greek temple. But in the Greek temple, you don't go inside, you're on the outside. In Greece, we have the Iliad and the Odyssey as our poem, and the Greek temple, and a notion of solidity, that you have the solid object, not in space. There is no such thing as abstract, empty space. This is not a Greek notion. And so the only people go inside a Greek temple are the priests to leave offerings, but the ceremonies take place outside, and then the wall, which is in ruins here, is shielded from us by the exterior columns. In China, one puts oneself in accord with the flow of nature, and so the temple is open for nature to flow in and out of it. Confucius gives us prescribed rules, and Lao Tzu tells us that underlying those rules, you should be in accord with those rules, but then those rules are built on the principles of nature. So then ultimately you are in accord with the principles of nature. So what would be the Western temple form? And I'm suggesting it's the Gothic cathedral. Now they built during what's called the Cathedral Crusade, roughly 80 of these major Gothic cathedrals. And these were huge investments. It would be quite an effort to build one of these things, for us to build one of these things today with our technology today. And they're building these things with no machinery. So what do we see here? We enter in a portal with twin towers, past the two pairs of opposites in the center into the body of the church. And I won't go through the parts, the nave, transepts, but we have these spectacular vaults reaching heavenward. This is Chartres we're looking at, but we could have chosen other examples. It's as though we took the massive heavy walls of the Roman bath, figured out exactly where the forces are going, left the structure where there are forces, and took away all the rest, so that the luminous presence of God can come through the stained glass. So it's my contention, we take an ancient Greek like Plato and put him in here, and he'd get nauseous, like on a roller coaster. This is just not a concept they have, being in a vast, vacuous space like this. These forces are carried from the inside to the outside by the flying buttresses, and then the outside comes to the inside through the stained glass. So if we look at the elaborateness of this structure, I'm contending it's a diagram of the structure of the psychology of the culture. That's what they were building. That's why they built these things, which were huge investments. So here's Constance, which I just picked because of the availability, the spectacular interior photograph. So you stand in there, you look up, and what is this telling us? It's telling us that the descendants of the people who built these cathedrals are going to be the people who will circle the globe and go into space. This is already in 1200, Western culture is laying down its program of how it sees its role, and it's this expansiveness, this availability to move not only up into these vaults, but out beyond them. Now the other part I described was the epic poem. So the way the temple form lays out the sort of spatial context in which we can move about. The epic, for any culture. For the epic poem lays down the moral structure of our individual lives. And I'm going to take as our epic poems for the West what's called the Arthurian romances, which are the stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. In one of them, Quest for Holy Grail, the knights set out on a quest to view the Holy Grail, but thought it would be a disgrace to go forth in a group, so each entered the forest at a point where he himself chose, where it was darkest and there was no path or way. If there's a path, it's somebody else's path. The only reason there's a path there is somebody went there. So you don't go in somebody else's path. In the West, you blaze your own path. And in school, what's the manifestation of that in school? What are you not allowed to do? Plagiarize, copy other work, right. In other cultures, you might be required to do that. And whereas not today, but traditionally, and in the West, we demand originality. Now, I'll pick the Percival myth. Percival was an unusual knight He grew up with his single mom, his father having been a knight, having been killed in combat, and she didn't want the same fate for her only son, and so she withheld from him any knowledge of knighthood. But one day he's out in the forest, and a group of King Arthur's knights on giant chargers with shining armor and flowing plumes come charging through the forest. He sees this, runs home, and says, "Mom, I'm going to go become a knight. This is what I want to do." So she dresses him in burlap, puts him on a donkey, sends him off, dies of a broken heart. And he goes off to King Arthur's court, where, sure enough, he is innocent of the ways of knights. His mother had hoped he'd get thrown out for being a rube. But he eventually becomes quite powerful because of the purity of his heart, unlike Lancelot. So what's Lancelot been doing? Screwing around with King Arthur's wife. But Percival doesn't get involved in that. On one of his quests, he comes to the castle of the Fisher King, who has been wounded, and his wound will not heal. And the wound, his illness, is indicative of or parallels his kingdom being a wasteland. In other words, the kingdom depends upon the vitality of the king for its prosperity. Percival is escorted into his castle, and he's moved to say, "What ails you?" But then he suddenly remembers a knight is not supposed to speak to a king until spoken to first, so he doesn't say anything. He blew it. The requirement was that he act spontaneously, and for once in his life, he did not. So he fails in his quest. He's turned away from the castle. He turns around. It's disappeared. For many years, he travels, doing good deeds, and comes to love Conduir, her name-evoking guide. And there's a notion here now of a new kind of love. So Eros is cardinal love, physical love. Agape is spiritual love that one has for all beings. But amor is a love for a specific other individual person. Now think of all the cultures that have arranged marriages. They are not built on amor. You eventually are supposed to grow to respect your partner, build a family with them, but this is not a love for that person. So in this new kind of relationship with a woman, Percival again finds the castle, asks the Fisher King what ails you, heals the king, and restores the land. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. This is going to be a kind of a base for what we're going to look at in Western culture. Now, one more thing. In the 12th century, in the 1100s, a figure named Adelard of Bath writes a book called Natural Questions. And in it, he says, it's a book on what we today call science, then called natural philosophy. And he says, natural phenomena must be explained by natural causes. No reference to supernatural causes are allowed. Nature is a closed system. Or as we would say, matter can be neither created nor destroyed. And you must rely on experiment, not authority. Here we are, very beginning of Western culture, which I'm taking as around 1,000, ballpark. The principles that we use to this day of science. So, already in the 11th, 12th century, with the Gothic cathedrals giving us our position in space and time, our appetite for conquest of space and time, which are operate according to set rules, which we call physics, And individuals are observers and participants in this world. And the moral center is in each person. So by 1200, we have that. That's the Western world to this day. It's laid down its principles. It's going to play them out, it's going to have variations on them, but this underlying core idea is laid down at that point. Now, I've used the term individual, so let's build an individual. And we'll start with a soul. So here's a Cimabue, late medieval painting of Madonna and Child. There really isn't any individual character in the face. We're not set in a physical space, but sort of a spiritual space of this gold leaf. We do not have a sense of anatomy. And then with the Renaissance, we'll get that. So here, in a Raphael, the figures become more realistic. They're fleshed out. They're in a natural setting. This now looks like a young woman. This looks like somewhat like a baby. And so with the Renaissance, we get this notion of an individual, which is still somewhat close to what we have to this day. So here's David by Michelangelo, and he is a body, physical anatomical body, as well as a psychology and a soul. With its closeness to Greek sculpture, Michelangelo is, and the other artists of his time who are doing the same thing, is making reference to bringing the humanism of the Greek and Roman world into their Renaissance. So our human being is physical as well as psychological and soul, and is rooted in the humanism of the ancient world. And there's a seriousness about how we're going to build this body. So Vesalius's book on anatomy, these artists understood in detail what they were dealing with here, which is why the muscular qualities of these sculptures look so realistic. Here in a Leonardo, with Mary and her mother Anne and then the baby Jesus, are set in a physical landscape. Leonardo becomes interested in studying nature, this physical landscape, as much as the human being, because it's a setting for human beings. And then the principles of nature are available to people to then adopt as machines. So here are designs for flying machines by Leonardo. And here is Raphael's School of Athens. And famously in the center we have Plato pointing upward, talking about his notion of the ideal realm, and Aristotle pointing outward, referring to the here and now, transplanted from ancient Greece into the then under construction nave of St. Peter's. And then surrounding them are all these characters from the contemporary and ancient worlds, representing art, science, mathematics, poetry, philosophy, and in a sense, these are all the parts of a complete human being. Once you get your liberal arts education, you're supposed to embody all of this. Now, in humanism of God, man, and nature, man is the highest and is central. Remember we said when we talked about China, we talked about the East, we said that, particularly when we talked about Japan and Shintoism and Ise Shrine, the human being is a natural animal, spirit is in all things. So God, man, and nature are one integrated thing. In the West, we've got them separated metaphysically, and the human being is the highest. We can know and control nature. Now, does this put the lie to what I just said? What are we looking at here? Who's the artist? Michelangelo. And the work is a panel from, great, Sistine Chapel ceiling. And this is, God has already created Adam, molding him from clay, and is now, I think it says breathing the spark of life into him in Genesis, in one of the versions of Genesis. But here, this touch is going to electrify and start him up. Now, this seems to be contrary to what I just said, right? Who knows what I'm going to do next when I push the button? Does anybody know what about 15 years ago somebody figured out? For hundreds of years, people were looking at this and no one ever noticed. And then about 15 years ago, somebody said, wait a minute. So God is within the human imagination. Now, Michelangelo's not going to say that out loud, but that's what's in there. With the Baroque, we get emotional depth, which we don't really have in the Renaissance. So here on the left is a portrait by Leonardo da Vinci. Not much going on behind the eyes. So what is this person thinking? Thinking? But in the Rembrandt self-portrait, Rembrandt was a very successful artist, but he had a difficult life. Several of his commissions were rejected by the clients. His wife died, his son died, he went bankrupt. He was a big spender, had huge art collections. His possessions were auctioned off. He was banned from selling his art by his guild. And so you see the depth of his experience over the course of his life molded into the features of his face in the self-portrait. So we have this depth of the human psychology being now, human emotions being introduced with the Baroque. Here's a series of self-portraits by Rembrandt over the years, from a young man to an old man. So this much more deeper sense of the self than we get with the Renaissance. And then we get into the early 1800s. We have a period called Romanticism, and the aesthetic becomes what's called the sublime. And Romanticism says the human psyche is beyond rational understanding. And the powers and forces of nature are beyond human understanding. All the Newtonian physics are not going to explain your experience of this mountain range, your experience of longing. Our young man, we're sure he's a poet, has been hiking across maybe the Alps, and he's on a mountain peak looking down at the fog, having this overwhelming feeling about the girl who dumped him, obviously. And so this is the sublime, which is a concept that's not there even in the Baroque. And then finally, anxiety, as we come into the modern era in Edward Munch's The Scream. So he sort of built up a range of the qualities and depth of what this individual is. And where are they going to live? Here we are in Palladio's Villa Rotunda. So the dome here is not referring to, it's not a dome of heaven, as it would be in Islam or St. Peter's or other instances, but it is a dome marking the spot for the human being. And standing here with the West borrowing, with the Renaissance borrowing the slogan from the ancient Greeks of Protagoras, man is the measure of all things. This is giving our man, the measurer, a central 0 point of the XY coordinates from which to measure. And then we have the dome, so we have X, Y, and Z for three-dimensional Cartesian coordinates. Now, back to the Needham question that we wrapped up our discussion of China with. So Needham was a scholar at Cambridge who spent a lot of time in China and started, it's still underway, an encyclopedia of Chinese technology. And China was until 1400, China was far in advance of the West in technology, in size, technology, wealth, etc. And so early Chinese inventions include the abacus, the shadow clock, which is sort of a sundial. They had flying machines by 300 AD, giant kites that you could hang on to and take off into the air, before the Wright brothers by 1,000 years. And four great inventions of ancient China: the compass, gunpowder, paper making, printing. So the Needham question is, why, after 1400, was China overtaken by the West? And there's several explanations. One of them, the Chinese had movable type and encyclopedias. But one of them was the difficulty of creating an encyclopedia with 250,000 different characters for the alphabet. It's kind of unwieldy to deal with. This little trick of the Phoenicians of taking a language, turning it into sounds, and then representing those sounds with 26 letters was a really smart move. You know, it's like any Roman sergeant could learn to read in a couple of hours, so that he could send messages back and forth from, the campaign that he was on. Which in China, you had to be an ancient sage and spend decades to learn to master this language. But Needham says it was because Confucianism, Taoism led to them embedding science in the culture as a whole, whereas in the West it was separated out so it could take off. Well, that's another explanation. Now, I'm going to interpret it a little bit differently. To ask why Europe leapt ahead while China stagnated is the wrong question. The question should be, why the difference between the West and all other cultures? Before 1400, if you go to Europe in 1400, what you're going to see in Paris, London, Rome, is going to be open sewers, filth, plague, disease, squalor, and poverty. Go to Rome in 300 AD, 250 AD, 300 AD. 1 million people population, aqueducts, water coming in, machinery, factories, advanced technologies, hot and cold running water in people's homes, central heating. They already had that in 200-300 AD in ancient Rome. You go to Peking, go to the Middle East, go to a city in ancient Egypt, 1500 BC, would be ahead of where Europe was in 3,000 years earlier, would be ahead of where Europe was in 1400. So it's not just China was ahead of Europe in 1400, everybody was. So then what happened? Here's my supposition. We get the emergence of the individual from the group. So we've laid down that notion already with the Gothic cathedral, the temple form, and the epic poem, Gothic cathedral and the Arthurian romances. But it starts to get implemented. The notion that the individual should discover and follow their own path, and the ability of the individual to pursue, now this is key, with less and less restrictions, their own visions. Now, By less and less restrictions, I mean Europe was a feudal society with people basically being slaves. You belong to the land, and there's a lord of the estate, and you belong to the land that he controls. But then you get the Black Plague. Suddenly, half of all the people in Europe die. Now for the survivors, that's going to be a real freeing of the individual. Like the lord of your manor just died. You can walk away. There's nobody, the guards all died. And there's a big labor shortage. Half of all people died. So people want your labor, and they're forced to bid for it. You're suddenly valuable as an individual. So, and then we get these beginnings of intellectual freedom. So while Galileo got locked up, spend the end of his life under house arrest, that you get less and less of that. And you get Voltaire being, it's too dangerous for him to stay in France, but he can go to London, where they've already achieved this intellectual freedom. And now the other key part is, okay, you pursue your own vision and you can get rewarded for it. In other words, okay, I can do my thing, but why should I? What if you could get rich? What if you could get famous? Is it worth being in my basement, building a social media startup for 3 years, not dating, eating pizza, sleeping under my desk? Well, how much is the founder of Twitter going to get when it goes public next month? 2, 3, 4, 5 billion? Maybe it's worth putting in 3 years of busting your butt trying to make a new steam engine, a new whatever. This is something no one's ever thought of before. It's not the social norm. It's not what we're doing. It's not the technique we're using. No, it's your new idea in a context which permits you to do something that's not the norm and gives you the possibility of being rewarded for it. So Leonardo da Vinci carried around his Mona Lisa portrait and his notebooks wherever he went from patron to patron. Think, maybe he had an inkling someday you could buy one of those notebooks for $30 million and millions of people would come to museums to see them. That his reward was not monetary, but it was fame, that he would be able to make his mark. So the freedom to do your own thing, being educated to be aware of your own ideas, not suppress them, and then the possibility of getting rewarded big time if you busted your butt and put the effort in to make the thing happen. And so this thing gives us artists. Is there anyone here you guys can't name? Leonardo, Rembrandt, Picasso, and Andy Warhol. Writers, Shakespeare, Jane Austen, Mark Twain, James Joyce. You just don't get this in other cultures. These radically different from everybody else figures blazing new paths in science. Newton, Darwin, Einstein, and Marie Curie. And in industry, Wedgwood, Ford, Carnegie, and Jobs. And just in lunatic, far-out visionary thinking. Voltaire, inventing among other things tolerance. William Blake, who said, not only can I not imitate another poet's poetry, I can't even imitate their form. I have to invent new form. John Bell, known for Bell's theorem that totally takes apart all of physics and says that the entire universe is instantaneously intertwined. And lower right is Lynn Margulies, who totally put to rest the notion of natural selection in evolution, showing that evolution takes place by bacteria moving around whole genomes and implanting them in different organisms to generate new species. So these are like totally off-the-wall thinking by these different figures that is permitted in this culture. And then this is to this day in popular culture. So there's the two leading mystery writers in the 1940s are Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler. And in an essay explaining the murder mystery, it's actually on the difference between the English amateur investigator and the American professional private eye. So, difference between Sam Spade and Miss Marple in Agatha Christie. And he writes, "Down these mean streets a man must go, who is not himself mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid. The detective must be a complete man and a common man, and yet an unusual man. He must be, to use a rather weathered phrase, a man of honor." It's very difficult to name a movie that is not this. Every movie, every TV show, something happens. There's an invasion of aliens, there's an epidemic outbreak, there's a serial killer. The organization, the scientific community, the police force, the government, the military, go after the problem, getting it all wrong. One lone individual says, no, it should be done this way. And he's vilified, he gets fired from his job, but in the end it turns out he was right. He saves the world, brings down a corrupt world, and for a time sets things right. So that's John Wayne in Stagecoach, Humphrey Bogart in Maltese Falcon, Alan Ladd in Shane, Vin Diesel in Riddick. How many people have seen the new Riddick movie? Really good. Matt Damon in The Bourne Identity, Angelina Jolie in Salt, all the Dirty Harry movies with Clint Eastwood. So there's this incredibly intense individuality in popular culture in movies like Gattaca, The Truman Show, Clockwork Orange. And to this day, a whole new version of this in what's called the long-form television drama. So, in defiance of all attempts to suppress it, a new individual is emerging with a deeper realism, confronting moral ambiguity, and a continued struggle to create a self. We then took a pause in our discussion of the West, and when we reconvened, we observed that I had done this entire presentation without mentioning Christianity. So it is typically assumed that Christianity is the fundamental underlying myth of Western culture, and I am suggesting otherwise. I'm suggesting that Christianity is an invading Middle Eastern authoritarian religion that fit very uncomfortably with the West, and there was a long period of bringing the two into sync, and that the Western psychology is more based in a native European sense than it is in Christianity. And then so we look at how Christianity, the ancient Greco-Roman world, and this native European sensibility interact. Okay, some thoughts about Christianity. And there are a lot of different ways the West is described. And a lot of speculation as to what was unique about it? Why did it take off in this particular period after 1400? One of the suggestions is that there was a unique confluence of the Hebraic Christian tradition and the classical Greco-Roman tradition. I'm going to disagree with that. And I'm going to suggest an alternative, that the classical world had died. Its bones, its remnants were still on the landscape. So very much we've adopted the architectural style until just 80 years ago. We were still using Greek and Roman columns and domes and vaults. But that's superficial. That's just borrowing a vocabulary. That's certainly there's influence from and respect for the Greek and Roman character, innovations, discoveries, but I think it's a mistake to say, oh, the Greeks invented democracy. But anybody can reinvent that any time. Just say, well, let's agree that we're going to get together as a community about this. And so I think the technologies, mathematics, for example, Greek mathematics is very rooted in geometry. Our mathematics really begins with algebra, totally different way of thinking. And Christianity, I'm going to suggest, was an invading foreign culture from the Middle East of authority and submission, which we've spoken about before. And it took a long time for Christianity in the West to get together, come into agreement. That for much of Christianity today, Christianity is about love. You go back to 1200, Christianity was about the authority of the church. And so what we think of Christianity today is, I'm going to suggest, very much an adaptation of Christianity to this Western point of view rather than coming from Christianity. So Goethe has Faust say, 2 souls, alas, reside in my breast, meaning the Christian and the classical, but there's a third one, which is a culture I just spoke about, the European culture born around the 12th century with the Arthurian romances and the Gothic cathedrals. A totally new, unique culture, just the way Greece was, just the way China was, just the way Egypt was, with its own point of view. Aware of other cultures, borrowing some things, but having its own inner psychology. Now, we look at the Gothic cathedral. Is it Christian? This is the building that these Europeans built. It grows out of the Roman Basilica, and then we have becoming early Christian, and we have the Romanesque, and then we have this sudden explosion into the Gothic. So, yes, there are many threads of influence leading to the Gothic cathedral, but I'm going to suggest one more, which is something we looked at earlier, Newgrange Passage Mound. So here we have this mound, and entering into it, there's a cruciform passageway. And this is a form that has repercussions. It's not the only one. There are others similar to it, but this is the most magnificent one. So let's look at Newgrange Passage Mound. We have, in effect, a nave, a transept, and an apse. And I'm going to use Chartres for our Gothic cathedral. A nave, transept, and apse. Here we are looking down the nave of Chartres. Here we are looking down what I'm calling the nave of Newgrange Passage Mound. Newgrange Passage Mound has what's called the light box above the door to bring sunlight in. Here it is, 4,000 years later, in Chartres Cathedral, the rose window. Looking up at the transept crossing of Newgrange, transept crossing of Chartres. So, what I'm suggesting here is the following. There's what we call a high culture. Suddenly, people get real serious about building a culture. And, I'm going to repeat myself, they lay down an epic poem in a temple form. And then within a short period of time, there's a huge investment in building out their temple form. So the time from the first Egyptian pyramid to the last Egyptian pyramid is about 300 years. The Egyptians did not build pyramids. One early period of Egyptian culture built pyramids, and just for a few years. Then they had laid down their temple form. They had expressed in form the spatial configuration of their culture. Same thing with the Mayan pyramid, same thing with Chinese temples, same thing with the Ise Shrine in Japan, that they make this investment to lay down in architecture the configuration of space in which they will live. Now, but where does that come from? Well, the people are already there. There's people on a landscape, and suddenly, pow, a high culture springs up just like that. Just a few years from the first Gothic cathedral to the last. It's, it's about 150 years, less than 200 years. But where did it come from? And I'm going to suggest that the underlying ideas that get crystallized in the high culture are there in a people on the landscape. And what's the evidence for this in Europe? Right here. 3000 to 2500 BCE. We already have this form in the European psyche. So it's a Christian cathedral, but it's in the form that's, we don't see this in the Middle East in Christianity. We see this in Europe, and I'm suggesting it's already there. There are two extremely important things that Christianity brings. One is that time is dynamic. In other words, for the Buddhists, it's always been, it always will be. The universe was never created. There was no Big Bang. What would it be created from? And it won't end. Where would it, if it blows up, all the dust will still be there, it'll just be in a different form. But Christianity has this radically dynamic concept of time. Time is finite. It's bounded. The world began 5,000 years ago in a garden. There's nothing, I don't know, who knows what was before that. But the world was created at a particular time. It moved along for a while, but then the fundamental nature of existence radically changed with the birth of Christ. What's one of the biggest changes that come with the birth of Christ? Right, you can go to heaven. Anybody born before Christ cannot go to heaven. And so Dante has special purgatories for all these wonderful, great people from the ancient world, Plato and Aristotle. Shouldn't they be in heaven? They can't, they weren't baptized. So they have a very nice purgatory with a health club and a spa and all that stuff. But they don't go to heaven. So the very metaphysical nature, the structure of our souls changes with birth of Christ. And then finally, There's going to be a second coming and it'll all wrap up. It'll end. So to have a beginning, a radical change, and an end is dynamic. Things change. They're not always the same. So time is dynamic. And I think a lot of this dynamism gets into the Western mentality. For example, we have a notion in Western psychology that things change, that you're born, this has really been discredited, but he used to say, you're born a blank slate and then you get raised by parents that are strict or not strict, and this happens and that happens, and your character develops over time. For the Greeks, you were born with your character. It didn't develop. Same thing with Darwinian evolution, that creatures changed over time. So Darwin observes that every bone in my hand here corresponds to a bone in a bird's wing. We're using them totally differently, and they're in different proportions, but they all correspond. Why is that? How does that come about?
They all came from a single creature.
They have a common ancestor, correct. Now, Aristotle, who's a brilliant biologist, made the same observation. His explanation was, because the Greeks don't have any more of a concept of time than they do of space, his explanation was that they all reflect the pattern of the mind of the maker. They're all made by the same maker. They do certain patterns in the mind of the maker, which could be a process or some type of God. And therefore we get these similarities of pattern. Of course, Darwin was totally scientific, but I'm suggesting that to think in terms of dynamic change over time, which Darwin does, it wasn't always the same. It was very different in the past. It'll be very different in the future. It is an influence of Christianity on Western thought. Same thing with Sigmund Freud, that your character develops over time rather than being born with your character, which maybe more think today. But certainly it's not the idea in psychology, is that it develops over time. Again, I think influenced by this time is dynamic. Now the other one is, what is the relationship between the phenomenal and transcendent worlds? This world and the transcendent world. Now, except for extreme materialists recently, most people hold there's some type of transcendence. Very few people in very few cultures hold that this is it. Okay, so there's something else, whatever that might be. What is the relationship between those two? How does one negotiate between them? Whether in this life, through maybe achieving enlightenment in Buddhist meditation, or going to heaven after you die, what happens in the afterlife. Greek notion was, you're around, but it's very shadowy. There's a point where Odysseus is able to visit the underworld. A few characters in Greek mythology visit the underworld. Yeah, the people are there, but they're kind of murky and struggling, and they've kind of lost a lot of their character definition. Well, so what is the relationship between those? Well, in Buddhism, the notion is, if you come to the right understanding, you realize it's all one thing. It's just, Lao Tzu says, ever desiring, one can see the manifestation, ever desireless, one can see the mystery, but the two are the same. It's our attachment that sees the duality. If you can withdraw from that attachment, you see it's, you don't have to go somewhere to heaven, it's here now. In Christianity, the soul makes a one-way trip. So in Buddhism, you have this continual reincarnating, everything's here forever. In Christianity, it's not clear where the soul is. In some Greek mysticism, which is very close to Christianity, and Christianity originates in Greek mysticism to some extent, the soul is floating out there. And then your parents get together and zoom, the soul zips in. Now, interestingly, some thought in zooming down, it's coming through all these spheres, which are the planetary orbits. Because the orbit of, say, the moon around the Earth there's a big crystal sphere. And that sphere naturally rotates, because that's what spheres do. That's why the moon moves around the Earth. And in coming through the sphere of the sun, the sphere of the moon, depending upon its position when the soul comes through there, it picks up characteristics. What's the common general term for that? The science of that? Astrology. That's why you get these different characteristics in astrology, because at the time of zoom of your soul coming in, or when you're born, or when you're conceived, it's different in different traditions. Okay, that soul now enters this temporal body, goes through a lifetime, and then goes to heaven or hell. So it's a one-way trip. So again, it's got to get this done now. You only get one trip. Whereas a Buddhist might say, there's a description that Joseph Campbell makes up in describing Alexander the Great breaks into India. He's conquered the Persian Empire. He says, let's go take India. And so he, goes into India, and then he wants to cross India and then come home by boat around India. And the soldiers has now spent 3 years with athlete's foot. They didn't have good rubber boots in those days. They've been hiking through swamps. They all got foot fungus. They haven't seen their wives in 3 years. They said, look, we want to go home. And he says, okay, we're going. He died on the way back and changed the history of the world. But when they get into India, they defeat the enemy. They go into the main town, and his soldiers show up and say, where are the philosophers? So where you find them out in a park. You go out in the park, there are these totally black, sun-baked, nude yogis in these bizarre positions sitting on the rocks. And Alexander's men in their shining armor, their red capes, show up and they say, we're students of Aristotle. We're here to talk philosophy. And the yogis look at them and they say, why don't you sit around to 5,000 or 10,000 incarnations and take off that armor, and then maybe you'll be ready to talk about philosophy. So, the Greeks know they only have one life. You've got to get it done now. The yogis are in no hurry. You don't get it done in this incarnation, do it in 10,000 or incarnations, 20,000. So again, this leads to a sense of urgency that other cultures don't have, because time is limited and the soul makes this one trip. And the relationship between this realm and that realm is facilitated through Jesus Christ, who is true man and true God, and therefore a link between these two worlds, two realms, I should say. So here is this dynamic quality of time. Michelangelo in the back of the Sistine Chapel, the Judgment Day with Christ sending souls into hell and into heaven, traffic directing which way they're going, the notion that things are going to wrap up. And this mediation between the two worlds, if we look at the central portal, the west portal of Chartres, main portal, above here is Christ surrounded by 4 animals representing 4 of the apostles, and he's coming through the birth canal of the universe. So it's a vehicle for the interpenetration of these two worlds, where things can come from one realm into the other. So Christianity creates this kind of dynamic for that. Buddhism does it totally differently. Hinduism does it differently. Finally, to conclude our discussion of the West, we look at a notion put forward by Robert Thurman, which he calls the Second Renaissance. And it's his premise that the West mastered the outer material world, while the East mastered the inner world of mind or consciousness, and the Second Renaissance will see a bringing of these two together. There's a term, the Second Renaissance, and the term is put forward by Robert Thurman, who's a very prominent American Buddhist teacher. He has a chair in Indo-Tibetan studies at Columbia University. He was the first ordained American Tibetan Buddhist monk, and good friends of the Dalai Lama. He's president of Tibet House, which is a cultural Tibetan organization in New York. Lectures widely, and you no longer have to go to his lectures because they're all on YouTube, which I've just started listening to. And he put forward a notion which he calls the Second Renaissance. And he says, the West mastered the outer world of material. The East mastered the inner world of consciousness. In the Second Renaissance, the West will bring the two together. So we have this phrase by John Archibald Wheeler, prominent physicist. He worked with Einstein. He coined the terms black hole, quantum foam. He says no phenomena is a real phenomena until it is an observed phenomenon. The Schrödinger cat paradox, where you have a cat in a box. We don't want to do this to cats, but that's how Schrödinger did it. You have a box, there's a cat in there. There's a vial of poison. There is a Geiger counter detecting particles being given off by radium, say. And it's a quantum phenomena whether or not a particle will be given off. If it's given off, the vial, Geiger counter opens the vial, and the poison is released, and the cat's dead. If this quantum phenomena does not happen, then the cat's alive. So we gotta open the box and look in there and say, oh, turns out the cat was dead. Turns out the cat was alive. Well, quantum theory says the cat is neither alive nor dead until we look at it. So our act of looking at it establishes, it's like, okay, the particle can go in either of two directions. Well, which one did it go in? We observe it. Oh, it went to the right, not to the left. Well, okay, it must have done one or the other on its own. No, quantum theory can show that it doesn't do either until we look at it. So now our observation becomes very much entangled with reality, our consciousness. And then we get, so Buddhism says our universe is a field of the interlocked minds of all beings. So what is the real reality here? And Buddhism, in effect, says it's the sum total of what everybody's thinking. You know, on a kind of pop psychology level, you can say one person, two people having the same experience, and one having a positive attitude is negotiating it very well and is happy, and the other one's miserable. It's how they are perceiving it. Well, so then Buddhism says, now think of that on a grand scale, where all the minds of all sentient beings together is the sum total of the universe. What is the fundamental stuff out of which the universe is made? And Buddhism says the field of our all interlocked minds. And the English physicist James Jeans said the universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. all this quantum theory stuff, and even what's going on in relativity. So you see these two things sort of coming together. And so Buddhism recognizes mind as a process rather than a thing. And Herbert Gunther, a great translator, great scholar of Buddhist material and translator of Buddhist texts, wrote this book, From Reductionism to Creativity, in which he's presenting some fundamental Buddhist thought. And he says, he's talking about a transition from structure-oriented thinking to process-oriented thinking. And he says it was impossible to write this book until recently because it depended upon things that happen in postmodernism, ideas of Heidegger, ideas of Deleuze, and ideas in quantum theory, which gave Westerners a frame of mind that they could even understand these concepts, that you could do the translation. So, if we look at the East here in China, we have in the Tao Te Ching, do you think you can take over the universe and improve it? I do not think it can be done. The universe is sacred. You cannot improve it. If you try to change it, you will ruin it. If you try to hold it, you will lose it. And on the right is a quote from a book, The Singularity is Near, by Ray Kurzweil, in which he observes the doubling of the capability of computers every year now. The computer doubles in capability. And he projects, okay, by 20 years from now, a computer chip will have as much circuitry as the human brain, and in 40 years, as much circuitry of all the brains of all the people who have ever lived on one chip. So he then sees a merging of humans and this machine capability into a new phenomenon. And when that merging takes place, he refers to as the singularity. It says the explosive nature of exponential growth means that it may only take a quarter of a millennium, 250 years, to go from sending messages on horseback to saturating the matter and energy of our solar system with sublimely intelligent processes. You know, it's going to be spreading people, robots, sensors all over the solar system. The ongoing expansion of our future superintelligence will then require moving out to the rest of the universe. So he's going from the solar system to the galaxy to the universe. If you go to the size of the solar system, eventually you need a lot of energy for these activities, and most of the sun's energy is lost, radiating in all directions. One little tiny point there, the Earth, it's getting a little bit of the sun's energy. But if you dismantle the planet Jupiter and distribute it around the sun as a big sphere, they're called Dyson spheres, they show up in Star Trek and stuff like that. You capture all the sun's energy so you can get involved in some serious intelligent activity. And then to get around the galaxy, you eventually want to develop black hole rapid transit systems. And then eventually, the physicist Guth has already shown that mathematically that you can actually generate universes. You can breathe them out of black holes. So where we may engineer new universes. So in the East, we have this respect for living with, putting ourselves in harmony with nature. In the West, this total hubris. You know, I mean, at some point they're going to talk about, let's just change the laws of physics. It's, you know, we're tired of this stuff. Let's just fix it. And we've pretty much been doing that since 1400 in a lot of areas. And these people just see it continuing to go. On the bottom here, is a conference I just went to, 2045. It's a bunch of Russian oligarchs that tend to be immortal and are building avatars into which they can download themselves. There's this time ship, a project I work on for cryonics. And then this is Seth Lloyd, who's a quantum professor at MIT, programming the universe. Well, you just, reprogram. And Stephen Wolfram, who I showed you later, says, I think when I find the computer code that generates our universe, it'll be about 6 lines. Very simple code can lead to very complex systems. And once you penetrate that, you can reprogram it. So, very different points of view. So here on the left, we've got Katsura Imperial Villa, very much integrated with its landscape in Japan. On the right, we've got Villa Rotunda, dominating its landscape, putting the human being at the top of the hill in the center of things. And then we have ideas from maybe both of these in Frank Lloyd Wright. And so, it's interesting to look at the process of the Easternization of the West and how and if these different points of view come together. So I showed you a slide before. I was talking about the Western individual and the lone hero who's up against the corrupt system and puts things right. And from 1971 to 1988, Clint Eastwood made a bunch of Dirty Harry movies in which he's a cop who brings justice with his .44 Magnum. Then he makes a movie in '93 called In the Line of Fire. And here he is on the bumper of John F. Kennedy's car, and when the first shot rings out, he fails to jump and take the bullet for the second shot. And so he's now known as the only Secret Service agent who ever lost the president. And he's in the wasteland doing counterfeiting, because the Secret Service guards the president and is in charge of counterfeiting. That's the 2 jobs in the Secret Service. And then there's a threat on the new president. And so he's brought in from the cold to work on the project because the bad guy, John Malkovich, is in touch with him. So, he's got to be on the case. And now there are women in the Secret Service. He's a real misogynist, and what are women doing here? But he comes into a relationship with her. And in the end, he takes the bullet for an attempted assassination of the current president, who's wearing a vest. And so this is an exact parallel to the Percival myth. I mean, every step of the way is exactly there. But then he does the movie Gran Torino. And here, he's a very disgruntled, grumpy, retired automobile worker living in Detroit. His wife has just died. He has lung cancer. He absolutely doesn't get along with his family. And his neighborhood is being taken over by Hmong, Cambodian refugees. And so he fought in the Korean War. He doesn't get along with Asians, but eventually they invite him over to dinner. He's getting along with them, and he sort of becomes a mentor to the son and a protector of the girl. But there's a gang in the neighborhood who are trying to recruit the son, and they eventually rape the girl. And he can't protect her. I mean, he can go out and shoot them, but there's always going to be more of them. So he's old, he has lung cancer, so he goes out and reaches for his cigarette lighter. They think he's reaching for his gun, open fire, they all go away for first-degree murder, and he's gotten rid of the gang. And he leaves his classic car. This is the last Gran Torino that came off the assembly line, so he leaves it to the boy, but more importantly, leaves the boy his tools, so he'll get a craft. And the girl's real smart, she'll be able to take care of herself. So the world goes on, but he's been a bodhisattva. He's sacrificed himself with exactly the right action to simply going up against the bad guys with bigger guns isn't going to do it. But there's a right action here, which is a totally Buddhist idea now coming into this Clint Eastwood movie.